In the years immediately following the end of World War I and the conclusion of the 1918 flu pandemic, America sought a return to normalcy. Americans hoped to return to the way of life they had lived prior to the outbreak of war in 1914 and the pandemic, which they had just struggled to overcome during 1918 and 1919. This led them to look to Warren G. Harding with his campaign of America First and American nationalism, as well as his campaign slogan of a return to normalcy, to lead the country through the early part of the 1920s. During this time period, there would be a number of conflicts and decisions that would help to shape life for many Americans during the next decade. America in the post-war period from 1919 to 1924 was a place of hope and promise. Many Americans were happy that the war was over and were proud that the Allies had won, specifically because of the role that America's troops and efforts on the home front played in winning the war. Many Americans were often better off than the people in the other nations that had been involved in World War I because the war was not fought on American soil. Since the war was not fought in America, we did not have to go through much of the rebuilding and recreation of our country that many other people throughout European nations faced following the war. Despite all this optimism, America was also a country that was confused about how it would readjust to this new post-war period. Many of the women who had found new jobs and a newfound sense of freedom and importance to America's economy and way of life faced challenges in keeping those jobs and freedom. There were over 4 million American men who had been deployed or trained to be deployed during 1917 and 1918, who all needed to be reintegrated and brought back into the American workforce and American economy. The country would also face a series of other challenges that included labor disputes and strikes based on the working conditions that workers were facing, as well as the development of a Red Scare in response to the ideas of communism that developed during the 1917 revolution in Russia, and a sense of xenophobia, which would lead to racial tension and violence throughout the country. The primary goal of America during the early 1920s was a process of demobilization. Demobilization refers to the country transitioning from a war-based economy, where we were producing weapons and war supplies, to a peacetime economy, where we would be producing goods that would be purchased by Americans adjusting to the new life in the post-war era. This process had several negative impacts on different groups of the American people based on who they were and what their connection was to the American economy of the 1920s. Many of the women who had successfully filled jobs that were vacated by men who were deployed to war were faced with the proposition of losing their jobs to the men who were now returning. Unions often looked down on and refused to support women in the workplace, and women were expected to give up their jobs and return to the life in the home that they had been living prior to the war. This negative response towards the women and the role that they played during the war led to the push for women demanding equality and the women's suffrage movement, where women fought for voting rights and an increased role in American life outside of the home and the traditional roles that they had filled leading up to 1914. American industry was also challenged by demobilization. Many of the American businesses that had been propped up and supported by military contracts during the war saw those contracts canceled and laid off workers as a result. American industry also went through an expensive and time-consuming process of converting their production and their factories from factories producing war-based goods to factories that would now produce consumer goods that could be sold to Americans to increase the country's profits and keep them financially successful. The problem with this transition is that many Americans could not afford the new goods that were being produced. Due to the costs of demobilization, prices of goods were often increased and became more expensive. The combination of increasing prices and workers losing their jobs led to an economic recession where businesses were not needed to produce as many goods as expected. This recession then trickled down to the workers who were working in the factories. Workers saw increased competition for jobs due to the lack of jobs available, as well as the fact that 4 million men were returning from war and looking for work. This competition for jobs led to higher levels of unemployment and lower wages for workers due to the increased supply of workers and the decreased demand for labor. These three trends of increasing prices, stagnant wages, and unemployment furthered the economic recession that would occur in the early 1920s. Lastly, soldiers who were returning from war often felt left out of this new peacetime economy. Many of the soldiers had lost their jobs as a result of fighting for their country, and while they wanted to return to the jobs that they left when they went to war, many of these jobs were no longer available because they were either replaced by other workers or as a result of the industrial changes that were occurring in demobilization. The challenges facing workers in industry led to three major strikes that would occur throughout the United States and helped to define America's view of labor in the early 1900s. The first of these strikes was the Central Labor Council strike, which occurred in Seattle in 1919. This strike, which was organized by the American Federation of Labor, saw 60,000 union members go on strike in response to the difficulties of demobilization in the shipping industry. This strike shut down the shipping industry in Seattle and had an impact on the American economy as goods were no longer moving. While the strike only lasted 5 days, it played a significant role in drawing attention to the situation of workers. The workers in this strike were not able to have their demands met and returned to work unsuccessful. While the strike itself did not have a significant economic impact, the visibility of the strike and the response to the strike was significant. In response to the strike and what was occurring in Seattle, city officials blamed the strike on foreign radicals. They went so far as to call the strike a revolution and gave the state militia the authority to shoot on sight anyone who was determined to be causing disorder or endangering the lives of citizens of Seattle. This strong response would be the first of several that would help to limit the influence of labor and shape America's view of striking workers in the 1919 period and early 1920s. The second of the major strikes was the U.S. Steel Corporation strike that occurred in September 1919 in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. Leading up to this strike, steel workers were demanding an 8-hour day, increased wages, and a 6-day work week where they would have Sundays off. While these demands were nothing new for workers in the Pittsburgh steel industry who had been fighting for them since the Homestead strike in the early 1900s, this strike brought additional attention to the situation workers were facing in the steel industry. In response to the workers' demands, company leaders refused to recognize the union or address the demands of workers, and over 360,000 steelworkers went on strike. Similar to the Seattle strike, these workers were accused of being anti-American radicals and people who were trying to promote foreign ideas of communism or anti-American ideas trying to hurt the country. Company leaders hired scabs or replacement workers to fill the jobs that were opened by the striking workers, and 20 strikers were killed in conflicts between replacement workers and union members. By the time the strike was over 100,000 union workers would lose their jobs, and the Steelworkers Union at U.S. Steel would ultimately fail and be dissolved as a major entity in the labor movement. The third and final strike of the 1919 year was the Boston police strike, which also occurred in September of 1919. Leading up to this strike, Boston police officers hoped to unionize and create a union that would help negotiate for higher wages and better working conditions for the police in the city of Boston. The city's police commissioner denied the demands of the striking workers, and ultimately 19 officers were fired for attempting to unionize the other members of the police force. When these 19 officers were fired, the rest of the police force went out on strike as well, as a sign of solidarity with the workers who had lost their jobs. Similar to the first two strikes, this strike was met with a very strong response by Massachusetts Governor Calvin Coolidge. Coolidge declared that the police were not actually on strike, but accused them of deserting their jobs and risking the health and safety of the people of Boston. Once the police officers were on strike, incidents of violence and looting occurred, where 2 people were killed and 9 were wounded, and the state militia had to be brought in to restore order. This hardline response from Coolidge would be significant once the strike was over. When the strike was officially ended, the officers who were involved in organizing the strike were fired, and many of them were replaced by veterans who had returned from fighting in World War I. These new officers received better pay and better working conditions, which is what the original police were fighting for, and many workers saw this as an insult to what the striking police officers were attempting to achieve. Coolidge gained popularity and recognition for his strong actions in response to the strike and in helping to maintain order in the city of Boston by deploying the state militia to help keep things under control. Coolidge's popularity would be important as he would be chosen to run as vice president along with Warren G. Harding in the election of 1920. When looked at collectively, America's efforts towards demobilization and the response of the workers and people who were involved played a significant role in defining life in the 1920s. As a result of these strikes and the conflicts that occurred along with them, many Americans began to view strikes and unions as a start of communist or foreign influence in our country. This fear of the influence of communism and other ideas led to the Red Scare of the 1920s, which is when Americans developed a fear of communism and the ideas that were being promoted during the Russian Revolution. And this fear carried over into the development of a sense of xenophobia and nativism, where Americans became more fearful and resentful of immigrants who were coming into the country. This fear of immigrants also led to racial and ethnic tensions between workers who were competing for jobs in America. And this collective process helped to shape America's view, as you can see in the political cartoon over here on the right-hand corner. Many Americans came to view labor and unions as the start of a slippery slope or a downward spiral that would cause harm to our country. They saw the efforts of labor and the steps that they took in terms of striking and walking out of their jobs as the first step in a process that would lead to disorder and violence, the influence of new and controversial ideas, and ultimately chaos and a challenge to the idea of returning to normalcy that many Americans were looking for. The other major result of demobilization was that Warren G. Harding and Calvin Coolidge were ultimately elected president and vice president in the 1920 presidential election. Their campaign of American nationalism and returning to normalcy took root among many Americans who wanted to see the country return to a sense of normalcy following the war. Once they were elected, Harding, Coolidge, and eventually Herbert Hoover would lead America through the demobilization process, and their election would be the beginning of what became known as the Republican decade, where these three presidents, Harding, who would die in 1923 and be replaced by Calvin Coolidge, and then Herbert Hoover, who would be elected after Coolidge, pursued policies focused on a smaller role for American government, less regulation of business and wages, and lower taxes, which was a stark contrast to the progressives who had been leading the country leading up to World War I. This new set of ideas and the decisions that were being made related to the American economy would play a significant role in the development of the 1929 stock market crash and the Great Depression, which would occur in the early 1930s. Lastly, the policies and changes that the country began to go through demobilization would play an important role in other social and cultural changes that helped to shape the 1920s as a time period known as the Roaring Twenties, due to the massive changes that America would see in its economy and basic day-to-day way of life. We will be examining all of these topics in future lessons within this unit.